It's an interesting thing to think about in terms of what it is to be a human being, because in the short term, of course, he didn't want to be kicked out of the league, although he understood it and said that David Stern saved his life. But so many great things happened after that that you could not have predicted. He had to rebuild himself and go through the minor leagues, but as a result, made his way out to Europe and had a 16-year career just in Europe itself, and is a legend in Italy and other countries like France. He met another woman and had the son that I referenced earlier, Michael Amir Richardson, who's a World Cup soccer player. And none of that stuff would have happened had the NBA not had this 3-strike rule, had David Stern not been the commissioner. And you never know what down moment in your life is going to lead to strangely amazing things.
And you are in Australia right now.
You're talking NBA basketball. You're talking great teams. You're talking great individual players.
Takes it off, and there's number 23, and of course Johnny goes nuts.
So I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it now.
I just tried to go out there and play my game.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Adam. I don't like anybody. I'm not a people person.
Strand, can you make the pass? Yes. Christian, can you catch the ball? Yes.
All the stars were aligned and all the muscles fired at the right time, and I was able to get off the ground and throw one down.
I was saving that as a surprise for you.
And now, introducing your host for In All Airness, Adam Ryan.
Welcome to episode 142. Thanks for joining me. I'm happy to welcome writer Jake Uitti to the show. He co-authored a newly released book with NBA and European star Michael Ray Richardson. Jake has also released books with Muggsy Bogues and Earl Cureton. Next year, he has 2 more NBA memoirs set for release, which we discuss in this conversation. You can purchase Jake's book via the affiliate link in the show notes for this episode, available at inallairness.com. Now, onto the show. My guest today is co-author of a new memoir with Michael Ray Richardson, detailing the life of the 4-time NBA All-Star. The book's title, Banned: How I Squandered an All-Star NBA Career Before Finding My Redemption. Jake Uitti, thanks for joining me.
Hello. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Congrats on the book up front and all the best with its release. We'll discuss that in just a moment, but I know that your work has appeared in many publications, Sports Illustrated, The Guardian, and The Athletic, to name just a few. I'm curious about your writing process. How do you decide what makes a feature article versus the tipping point where you think this deserves to become its own book?
That's a really great question. I'm wrong a lot, so we'll put that up front. But I've been writing long enough that you just get like a little gut feeling, oh, an idea pops in your head, and if you can sort of envision the article unfurling in front of you, oh, I could see 1,000 words here or whatever. And then, of course, editors help. You pitch an idea to an editor, and sometimes they'll reject it, sometimes they'll critique it, and oftentimes, hopefully, that they'll accept it. There's lots of stuff that could be a book. There's really amazing writers out there, and not every book is for every writer to jump in and undertake. Things that have worked for me are co-writing these memoirs and working with a specific person and writing them from their voice and from their perspective and spending months with them and talking with them. But there are people who write like Chris Herring about a decade of the Knicks. It's a different type of book. One's not better than the other necessarily by definition, but it's different styles. And I have great reverence for people like Chris or like Miran Fader, who wrote the Giannis and Hakeem books. It's just whatever fits. Get in where you fit in, as they say. And I've had good luck co-writing these player memoirs.
When did you know that you wanted to share Michael Ray Richardson's life story?
I'd done books previously with Muggsy Bogues, the shortest player in NBA history at 5'3", and with a friend of his I met through Muggsy, a guy named Earl Cureton, who became a very good friend of mine before he passed away, sadly. Earl was sort of one of those players who had to scrape to stay in the league. He wasn't a Michael Jordan or Magic Johnson. He was the 8th man, 9th man, spot starter here and there, but he'd won 2 championships in the NBA. His story is really cool. And through Earl, one leads to the other. I met Sugar and Michael Ray Richardson, and I was on the phone with Earl, and he would call me almost every day, or I'd call him. And he just mentioned that his friend Michael Ray was interested in doing a book. He'd heard about the book that Earl and I had almost finished at the time, and Michael wanted to do his own. I'd sort of heard of Michael. I wasn't familiar with the story. He left the NBA when I was 3 years old. So I was born in 83. And so I didn't have a chance to really dig into his career. He was offered a book deal for $1 million after he was kicked out of the NBA, but he didn't take it because it would have required him to squeal or rat on other players who were caught up during the NBA's cocaine era, which was also the world's cocaine era. Sometimes it's just pigeonholed to the NBA. Michael wanted to do a book, and Earl connected us. And I think the first time that Sugar and I talked, we started the interviews. Like, we had great chemistry. He's got a great heart, very personable person. I like to work fast, and so that's what we did.
What's your research look like, Jake, particularly when you are preparing for books like this one with Sugar Ray?
Google is a big help, and YouTube is a big help. But the co-writing of a memoir is a little bit different than like a Mir and Fader book about Giannis, where she's writing it from the third person perspective, a little bit removed. I'm working with the person directly, and ultimately it's their book. Sugar, we talked certainly every week and almost every day. There's a documentary about him from, I think it was about 2000 or so, that Chris Rock narrated, so you watch that. And I'm an avid reader too. You have a lot of great books behind you on your bookshelf. So I'll read memoirs of people he's connected with, like Daryl Dawkins. And there's another book loosely about Sugar by another author that he doesn't like, but I read that to get a little background. And I don't think everything in that book is accurate from my perspective, my opinion. I'll interview people like Buck Williams that he was teammates with, Bob McAdoo, or whoever else I can reach out to. And hopefully the person you're writing a book with will connect you with some of those people. But ultimately, the source is the main source. So Michael Ray was the big source, and he's try to comb his memories, and then you try to verify that stuff on Basketball Reference or whatever else.
Your book definitively solves one of the world's great mysteries, the correct spelling of Michael's name.
Yeah.
Quote here from the book: "At some point during my life, the world began to spell my name Michael, E-A-L. It's too often spelled E-A-L and not Michael with A-E-L, as it's traditionally written," end quote.
He doesn't remember the point where it changed, but if you look at some of his old basketball cards even, it's A-E-L as the traditional way. As he says, it's on his birth certificate, A-E-L, and his college stats. At some point, it got changed to E-A-L, but his email address is A-E-L. His son, Michael Amir Richardson, who's an Olympic soccer player, he just won a bronze medal in the most recent Olympics, he's A-E-L. Somewhere along the way, it became E-A-L. In a strange way, it's a little bit of a microcosm for Sugar that things went backwards there for a minute, and now they're back on track.
That's a good point, and Basketball Reference needs very few corrections, but as of this recording, they actually have Michael's name spelled E-A-L.
Yeah, them and Wikipedia, I think, does as well.
How do you approach talking about such difficult to discuss subject matters covered in the book?
Great question. When we were doing the interviews, I would be the one that would be a little nervous, but he was an open book, literally. And I think that was one of the reasons he wanted to do this book, was not only to get his story out and to share it with the world, but there's people who suffer from addiction every single day. And it's nice to know that there are successful people and people who turn their lives around. He wanted to get all that stuff out. The one rule, the one third rail was he didn't want to out anybody who wasn't already out for having struggled with drug abuse in the 80s in the NBA. Any question I had for him, he was an open book, and it remains so. That made it really easy, actually. And I found myself being the only one that was kind of tiptoeing. And every time I would tiptoe around something, he would just kind of like, okay, let's talk about it. It's not a big deal. One more point to that is his drug addiction and his time suffering with this, shooting himself in the foot to a degree, is a small chapter of his life, maybe 5 years, give or take, depending on how you count things. He didn't come into the NBA doing drugs, and he didn't finish his career as a professional basketball player doing drugs. And it was only a few years in the middle that he just kind of went haywire, sadly. So when you talk to Michael, he's not still working through these issues. He's been sober for 30 years. And so there's a little bit of a removal as well.
Importantly, in the back half of the title of the book, Before Finding My Redemption, that obviously rings true, and it's such a fascinating story. He was born in 1955, as he writes, on a kitchen table in his family home of Lubbock, Texas. He described the town aptly as, quote, a shithole, end quote, a terrible place to grow up if you're black, in his words. He was the third eldest of 6 siblings. When he was just 5, his mum, Luddy, moved to Denver, Colorado, in search of a better life for her family. She soon landed a job, and then circumstances led to the rest of the family then following her north. His biological father, Billy Jack, was hardly ever around. a tough upbringing, to say the very least, before they had opportunity in Denver.
And as a result, he was a really good kid. His mom was amazing. And so much of this book focuses on her generosity, her hard work, her ability to raise the family. We call her the warrior throughout the book. Every time she's mentioned, it's Kama, the warrior. He really has a lot of reverence for her. And of course, what would the world be without great mothers? And certainly his is one of them.
He writes that he began playing organised hoops in 6th grade when a principal at his elementary school doubled as the team's basketball coach. From that point, his obsession with basketball grew. He would tell her that he'd go on to make the pros one day. He'd buy her a house, which was quite a warming story too, which did come to fruition.
That was one of the first things he did when he made the Knicks, was buy her a house. And in some ways, I often wonder, like, when you achieve your dreams by X years old, whether that's 17, 27, 40 something, in some ways was the climax of at least some part of his life. You know, he wanted to help her for all the stuff that she'd given him. And the metaphor for that was buying her a house, and he was able to do it. In some way, maybe that's when he let up a little bit. Maybe there was a little bit of like, oh, I've done this, and so now I can take a half a breath. Sometimes when you take a half a breath, the devil can come in. But such a heartwarming story when I think we maybe ended a chapter saying, I bought her the house, and that was such a big goal achieved.
Now, Michael had a stutter, a slight lisp that led to him being called Mumbles by some of his school peers, which obviously is cruel. He had speech therapy classes in 8th grade, and he'd end up using that teasing as motivation, coupled with his obsession to be the best he could be on the basketball court. How important do you think that motivation was to him in those high school years, Jake?
That's a good question. I wish he was here to answer it. He got used to criticism early on. Therefore, he learned how to get through it, and he learned it wasn't going to end his career, end his position anyway. He became a strong individual. And, you know, if you hear him talk today, he's got a strong stutter still. And he speaks some other languages because he played overseas a bunch. And it's funny that I don't think he stutters in any other language besides English. He's learned techniques when he's tripping on a word to get past it. Water off a duck's back type of mentality, which I think you obviously have to have if you're going to be a professional athlete and to have any sort of success.
There was standing room only at his varsity games when he played at Denver's Manual High School. And as his popularity increased, he met his high school sweetheart, Renee. Renee is a key figure early on in the book, and they would go on to marry and have a child together. He won the Colorado State Championship as a junior, but you're right that he had to bide his time and wait for that senior season before he could really display his immense talent.
Some players, when they're freshmen, they're bound for greatness. But Sugar wasn't one of those people. He had to develop and barely got a scholarship by the end of his senior year of high school, barely made a D1 school in Montana, and then began to flourish, got a growth spurt, probably understood his body more and learned what he could do. Dr. J was one of those players. He went to UMass, which wasn't a huge school at the time for basketball, and he only blossomed in the ABA. Sugar was one of those guys that just took a little while.
During those high school years, he writes that he spent time with ABA players, primarily from the Denver Rockets at the time, including Ralph Simpson and Al Smith. They helped give tips on what pro coaches were looking for in the ABA or NBA in terms of talent, which definitely helped hone his game. And he also writes about his admiration for Spencer Haywood and his trailblazing ways. Given the lack of that father figure, it was very important for Michael to nurture those friendships, Jake.
Yeah, I live in Seattle here, and there's such a great network of people like Jamal Crawford and others, Gary Payton, who've nurtured the next generation. And so I love hearing those stories that great professional players in Denver at the time, like Ralph Simpson and others, would take up-and-coming players like Michael under their wing and allow them into pickup games and get to test to see where you are, where you need to improve. And when Michael was growing up, having a pro team in Denver was huge. He may not have made the pros if it wasn't for the Denver Rockets at the time.
After a heartbreaking loss in the final of the Colorado High School Championship game, University of Montana's assistant coach, Jim Brandenburg, visited Denver, and then he invited Michael to fly to the campus the following week to check out the facilities and meet the head coach, Judd Heathcote. He was told he'd get serious minutes as a freshman, which obviously helped him sign that letter of intent with the Grizzlies, a key stepping stone in Michael's life.
That was the selling point, that he would get playing time as a freshman. And back then, freshmen didn't get a lot of playing time, and in the pros, rookies didn't get a lot of playing time. So if a coach would guarantee that, that was a major selling point for Sugar, and he wanted to hit the ground running.
In his freshman season, Montana went 21-8, and they made the NCAA tournament for the first time in school history. They lost by just 3 points to the would-be national champs UCLA in the West Regional semi-final. He writes that he didn't know it at the time, of course, but that would be his only appearance in the big dance during his 4 years at Montana. But certainly it showed that he could play and mix it with the best in the nation at that time.
Sugar, I think, was the first player from Montana drafted, maybe one of only 2 players even still. He was a big fish in a not as big pond. It makes sense that he would help bring the team, even as a freshman, to the big dance. He did well in college, but never got a chance to challenge for the title.
I think Larry Kristoviak is the only other name I can think of from Montana that made it to the NBA. Now, Michael's nickname, Sugar, or Sugar Ray, was used, unfortunately, to refer to his addiction, but it's important to distinguish between the nickname's origins versus how it was possibly used in future years.
As he says, like, sweet on the court, sweet off the court. Sugar wasn't wanting for attention and maybe ladies' attention as well. He's such a charming, charismatic person, as lots of addicts can be. I come from a family of addicts, and he and I had that bond, and I sort of understand what that mentality and what that life can be. And you're very, very charming when you have that side to you. And it makes a lot of sense that people saw him as such a sweetheart. And he is a sweetheart. 30 years sober, he remains a sweetheart. He's very funny, very quick-witted.
During his junior year, he faced serious allegations of sexual assault. He was cleared of any wrongdoing, but he had to prove his innocence via a lie detector test. How was it for you to hear Michael relive that terrible accusation, which could have had huge impact clearly on the rest of his life?
There's an all too familiar part to that. This is obviously a thorny and difficult issue. There's a lot of sexual assault that happens in the world, a lot of violence that men put on women, and it's tale as old as time. But within that, there's also false accusations, and it's really hard to know how to deal with that and talk about that subject. I mentioned the book that I did with Earl Curitan, and in that book, someone accuses one of Earl's friends of a very heinous thing similar to that, and the guy did not do it. And thankfully, he had a coach in his corner that would talk to the police, and then the police eventually found the person who did it. But the woman who was aggressed upon saw Earl's friend and just kind of pointed at him. Maybe she didn't recognize his face. In Sugar's case, he alleges, I obviously wasn't there, but the woman was made fun of for sleeping with him because he's a black man. And in order to save face to her friends, she accused him of some very heinous things. It's difficult to talk about, but Sugar was open about it, and it was a major point of his life. And the fact that he took a lie detector test that proved he was innocent, and that the woman didn't want to follow up with anything after that lie detector test showed that he was in the right.
In the book, you also recount a key game in Michael's senior season that involved Hall of Fame great and 2-time NBA champion Willis Reed. He was entering his second season as the Knicks coach, and he made a personal scouting trip to Flagstaff to see Richardson play. Michael didn't disappoint. He had 22 points on 11 of 21 shooting in a win over Northern Arizona. A key moment in Michael's soon-to-be future in the NBA, playing in front of his would-be coach, Willis Reed.
We just talked about a very difficult moment, but there's a lot of serendipitous good moments in Sugar's life. And to have Willis Reed, who's one of the 30 greatest players ever, come and see you and to have a great game on that night, as the Knicks historical guards are dwindling, and like Walt Frazier and Earl Monroe, they need a new guard, and Willis Reed knows the value of having a great point guard. Just a lot of great things to come in one game. And when someone sees you play a great game, that leaves an indelible mark. And Willis picked him fourth in the draft, 2 picks ahead of Larry Bird, just months after that.
Michael averaged better than 24 points a game as a senior, and he led his team to a 20-8 record, though they missed postseason play after a heartbreaking loss to Weber State. That ended his collegiate career, but he did leave the school as then its all-time leading scorer, and his name is still littered amongst the record books of the Grizzlies. On the day of that 1978 NBA draft that you briefly alluded to there, Michael was actually at Montana University. This is a great story, and he was outside just playing hoops. If you recall the particulars, how did he learn about making it to the NBA?
Yeah, someone heard it on the radio and just kind of ran down and got him and said that Willis Reed is going to be calling back here. Can you imagine? I mean, with all the pomp and circumstance that the NBA goes through now with the draft, players are flown in with suits, given hats, interviewed on ESPN. The idea that a potential Hall of Famer like Sugar is shooting around essentially the backyard at college, really hard to fathom. In the top 4 pick, hears about it through a friend on the radio.
I had a great smile as I was reading that recount. Michael was slated as the next Walt Clyde Frazier, a 7-time All-Star in New York before he got traded to Cleveland after the 1977 season before Sugar arrived on the Knicks. Unfortunately, Willis Reed was fired after a 6-8 start in Michael's rookie season. How do you think that affected him going forwards?
That was tough because he was getting playing time under Willis Reed. He was Willis's handpicked guy, but then when Red Holtzman comes in, who'd won 2 championships with the Knicks, a legendary name, he didn't want to play rookies. He didn't want to play Michael. All's well that ends well. The next year, Red put the ball in Michael's hand, and he was an all-star. He led the league in steals and assists. So something went right along the way. It's an interesting what if Willis Reed had stuck around, what might have happened to Sugar.
Within the book, you insert reflections from important people in Michael's life. They're titled Memory Lane. Some of them are heartfelt and some of them are hilarious. It depends on which recount you're looking at. You do the same in your Muggsy Bogues memoir, perhaps in your other books as well. It's a great way to add further context to a player's life story. Where does that actually originate from, Jake?
I'm glad you like it. When I was writing the Muggsy book, I knew we were going to be interviewing a bunch of people, and I didn't really know how to put in big chunks from someone else. You can weave them in as if Muggsy says it or as if Sugar says it, but I kind of liked the idea of putting it at the end in their own voices because it's a little bit like a documentary. You're kind of watching the documentary of someone's life, and then you see the talking head, like the comedy show The Office. You see the scenes transpire, and then it cuts to someone talking. I kind of liked ending each chapter with someone who was generally part of that chapter talking about Sugar, in this case, a third-person perspective, and I'm glad it worked for you.
Very clever way to do things. As you mentioned, Michael became just the 3rd player in NBA history at that time to lead the league in steals and assists in a single season. A terrific year overall. He was named an All-Star for the first of 4 times. Quick context here for our listener. In just over 37 minutes a game, he averaged 15.3 points, 3.2 steals, over 10 assists and 6.5 rebounds per game as the team improved to 39 and 43. They just missed the playoffs because of a tiebreaker to the Washington Bullets, and he was named first team all defense too, which would be the first of 2 times he'd received that. He went on to lead the league in steals 3 times in the relatively short time he was actually in the NBA. So some incredible achievements there, and quite often there's a what if may have happened had he had the opportunity to continue playing in the NBA into the 1990s.
I wrote an article for an outlet recently, and it's the people who could have challenged Michael Jordan because there's so much interesting what ifs of that time. Len Bias died, Reggie Lewis has died, Drazen Petrovic died, Magic Johnson gets AIDS, Sugar deals with his own addiction. And so there's a lot of people who could have been a rival to Jordan because he didn't really have that rival in a lot of ways. He beat everybody. Sugar had one of the greatest careers of the 80s. He was Magic Johnson before Magic Johnson, a big guard before Magic Johnson came in, and they even shared the same college coach and Judd. His potential was limitless. He talks about things that like God never gives you anything you can't handle, and our story is written before it even happened. So he has a good perspective on that sort of thing, but once a year it probably gnaws at him. He showed big highs, no pun intended. They just didn't extend for as long as they did for Magic or someone like that. Larry Bird at one point calls him the best player in the NBA. It's for a flash. It's not for an extended decade, for example. But he did have those moments in Europe, which is sort of the redemption part.
He had everything in front of him late into his 3rd season with the Knicks in 1981. He writes that he first tried cocaine. New York went 50 and 32, and they made the playoffs for the first time in his pro career. However, he says that his judgment began to wane. He was becoming increasingly fond of spending time in nightclubs like Studio 54, and he talks about people in his life who were shocked that he was involved with drugs. And there's one particular quote I'd like to quickly mention. From there, so much went downhill, as any Knicks fan back then would tell you, end quote. It started to bottom out at that particular time. His life took a turn for the worse.
It's very sad, of course. It wasn't one big crash. It was kind of the result of like drips and drops of being asked. Late 70s and 1980s, cocaine was everywhere, from Caddyshack, creating that movie, to Doctors and Lawyers. It was considered a high class thing to do. So it didn't have the same stigma that it does now, and people didn't realize it ruined lives. So he was just kind of peer pressured to death. And someone who he thought was his friend, who lived in the same building, who was actually introduced to him through the person who moved Sugar from Jersey into New York. It was that guy's brother, very strangely. He was offered cocaine one too many times and decided to do it. And kind of the floodgates opened after that.
Michael was traded to Golden State in October 1982, largely in return for Hall of Fame great Bernard King. But within 4 months, the Warriors traded Richardson to the New Jersey Nets for Sleepy Floyd and Mickey Johnson. So a very tough time personally and professionally for him. He did, though, have a great season in 1985. He played all 82 games for the Nets. He averaged over 20 points, 5.5 boards, over 8 assists and 3 steals a game. So a terrific season. Though they were swept in the first round by the Detroit Pistons, he won the NBA Comeback Player of the Year after rehabbing from substance abuse.
I think Golden State was kind of his darkest moment. And then New Jersey was certainly like a really high point. In the playoffs in 84, they beat the 76ers, defending world champs at the time. So that was one of the flash high moments. I think it was after that Bird said he was one of the best players in the NBA.
The book begins with Michael reflecting on that fascinating 1984 playoff matchup against the Philadelphia 76ers, his lower-seeded New Jersey Nets against Julius Erving, his idol, and the Philadelphia 76ers. The road team won every game in that series, which was something which has rarely happened before or since. The decisive fifth game was in Philadelphia. That victory for the Nets actually was probably the biggest moment in the franchise's history to that point since they merged from the ABA. So all that said, Richardson had a fantastic game. He went for 24 points, 6 assists, 6 rebounds, and 6 steals. A great win in his NBA career.
Yeah, the famous quote from Dr. J, basically that the Nets don't even need to travel and that the Sixers are going to win the fifth and deciding game on the home court. And the Nets coach showed them that on the bus. And I think it got everybody very, very excited to win that series. And as Sugar talks about, their guards were just bigger and the Sixers guards couldn't handle them. And so that was the decisive thing. And Albert King, who's Bernard King's brother, a lesser known guy, or at least now he is, but he was big. And Dr. J was older at the time, despite being Sugar's idol growing up. He used to have posters of him and everything. But Dr. J couldn't handle Albert King, who was younger and more athletic at the time. They had Albert King bring the ball up and kind of initiate the offense. Stan Albeck, the coach of the Nets, had a really great game plan. The Nets almost beat the Bucks to go to the Eastern Conference Finals, but there was kind of a controversial call and a tough outcome there too.
In late February of 1986, Michael was suspended from the New Jersey Nets and his NBA career was effectively all but over. He did have the opportunity, as you detail in the book, to return to the NBA in the early 1990s, but chose to remain in Europe, which we'll get to in just a moment. But what can you tell us briefly about that terrible time in Michael's life where his third and final strike came up with the NBA office?
It's an interesting thing to think about in terms of what it is to be a human being, because in the short term, of course, he didn't want to be kicked out of the league, although he understood it and said that David Stern saved his life. But so many great things happened after that you could not have predicted. He had to rebuild himself and go through the minor leagues, but as a result, made his way out to Europe and had a 16-year career just in Europe itself and is a legend in Italy and other countries like France. He met another woman and had the son that I referenced earlier, Michael Amir Richardson, who's a World Cup soccer player. And none of that stuff would have happened had the NBA not had this 3-strike rule, had David Stern not been the commissioner. And you never know what down moment in your life is going to lead to strangely amazing things. Sugar credits David Stern with saving his life and didn't want to return back to the NBA when he had a chance. The 76ers asked him to come back after he was reinstated in 1988. So Sugar is the first person banned for life from the NBA. He's also the first person reinstated several years later. And 76ers had a player who was injured and they called him seeing if he would come, and he declined because they wouldn't give him a second guaranteed year. He ended up being a legend in Europe. He's an icon in countries all over the world instead of just America.
Quite fitting, really. It's a fantastic story from the lows of what he experienced in the NBA on the court and, of course, off the court to what he then would go on to achieve. And it's detailed beautifully in the book. He does credit that decision to move to Italy in 1988 as the standout moment of his career. It did enable him to play so many more years, well into his 40s, which was quite remarkable at that time as well.
Yeah, I could barely pick up something off the floor, and I'm 41 years old. I can't imagine playing professional basketball. All this is a testament to Sugar. You know, when something bad like this happens, how many people in the world would recoil, would live in a dark room with a bottle of alcohol watching ESPN? But he fought and he pushed forward and he achieved a lot as a result.
Is there anything from the book that we haven't covered today that you'd like to make mention of, Jake, before we touch on a couple of books you've got forthcoming?
Two things. Sugar's a big family man now. He's got several children. One's a doctor, and one, Michael, who's a professional soccer player. And he talks to all of his children almost every day. And the other thing that people should learn about in the book is that he was also a multi-time championship coach in the minor leagues in the CBA. He was a very good motivational person, had a great eye for talent. And in those leagues, which can get a little rocky here and there, he steered the ship many, many times and won, I think, 5 different championships in the minor leagues.
Incredible achievements.
When you have a salacious detail of cocaine and being kicked out of the NBA, it's really hard to pierce that narrative, which is one of the reasons we wanted to do the book. But there's obviously so much to his life and to anyone's life who has a low moment like that. And as the saying goes, we're not our lowest moments. We're not our darkest times. So I'm glad people are getting a chance to see his story in full. Thanks to you. I appreciate you shedding some light on it.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for writing the book and working with him to put it out. It's fantastic. Just before we got recordings today, you were talking about having just received the hardcover of the book. How does it feel when you get to open that package up, all the hard work that's gone into it, and actually hold that in your hands, knowing that it's only a couple of days away from release?
Well, this time it's especially good because I am in love with the cover. It's a big orange, bright cover with the word banned on it. It just looks like a book that people are, I hope, are going to want to pick up off the shelves and read and hopefully purchase. I particularly love how this book looks. It was especially gratifying to take my house key and open up the big package. I was like, what the heck is this? You scrape it across the tape to open it up, and then you see these big orange books. It was great.
You've got 2 more NBA books to your name. In 2022, you released Muggsy, My Life from a Kid in the Projects to the Godfather of Small Ball. And in 2023, you released Earl the Twirl, My Life in Basketball. As we mentioned, sadly, Earl Curitan, very good friend, passed away in February 2024. Next year, you have 2 books slated for release, NBA related, one with the newly minted Hall of Famer Michael Cooper, and then also Tim Hardaway, another Hall of Famer, both names clearly well known to our audience here. I own the Muggsy Bogues book. It's a great read.
Thank you.
What can you tell us about those forthcoming releases and the work behind the scenes to get those books onto shelves sometime next year, Jake?
It was such great timing for Coop to make the Hall of Fame that we did this book. He's got many interesting aspects to his story, but he's one of 3 people who won the 5 championships in the 80s with the Showtime Lakers, Magic Johnson and Kareem being the other 2. And those are 2 of the greatest, certainly 5 or 6 ever. And so for Coop to be the 3rd person amongst those 5-time champion, you know, that says something about him. And he's a defender. He was never a 20-point scorer, never an all-star, but he was as necessary to winning as anybody else. So I love getting a chance to tell his story. He went to the junior college system. He didn't go to a major D1 school. So it's just these stories of people who make it, who aren't Lou Alcindor, the number 1 player in New York City and just kind of an MVP forever. There's a lot of ways to make the NBA. There's a lot of ways as a metaphor to be successful. And then Tim Hardaway sort of falls into the Sugar camp where he had a really dark moment in his life. He said some really horrible things in 2007. He had to work his way back and he had to prove that he was worthy of making the Hall of Fame after that. And he had to atone for that difficult time. I think it's really easy these days. Everybody talks about cancel culture and whatever, and I don't want to necessarily get into the politics of that, but it's easy to throw someone away. I don't really like that idea. And Tim Hardaway, I had the chance to speak with him and we talked about doing a book. And like I said, I'm 41. So the 90s was exactly my sort of wheelhouse of NBA fandom. And so I saw him like everybody else every Sunday or Saturday on NBA, on NBC with the dun, 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 and then the Heat and the Knicks. He was like in my house and in my face all the time. And so it was great to work with him and learn his story of redemption and apology and growth. Tim Hardaway, the killer crossover, there's so many moments in his life where he's on one side of something and then gets to the other, not just on the basketball court, but on certain issues. Certainly what he said about gay people in 2007, he was certainly on one extreme. He's now squarely on the right side of things. And so I wanted to learn what that kind of story would be like. And I hope people read it. And I hope people find out.
Yeah, that's a great way to phrase it there. One quick thing, the bio on your website reads that, quote, soulful meals, thoughtful music, thrilling sports, and compelling conversations are your true loves. You are in Seattle. You've been there for over 15 years, a city that's well known for the 1990s, particularly, I guess, the grunge culture. I read that you were also wanting to write about Seattle's relationship with basketball. Obviously, Pearl Jam fits in very nicely with that. Is there any possible book in the works to do with Seattle, 1990s Sonics, or any other combination thereof?
Yes, there is a unpublished Seattle Supersonics manuscript that's being shopped right now.
Wow.
We'll find a publisher within the next few weeks, knock on wood.
That's fantastic.
And I hope to work with Sean Kemp in the future. We've talked about something, and who knows if that'll come to fruition, but I would like to work with him on a book.
Now you've just set the scene beautifully for what might lay ahead.
Yes, and I'd be happy to talk with you again when any of those projects come out. It's been great to speak with you.
Thank you. It's been great to have you on the show today, Jake. Thanks again for making yourself available to discuss band, and I hope it's a tremendous success, and I wish you all the best in the future and happy traveling in a couple of weeks' time.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, we'll be in the UK on a rock and roll tour with my 9-month-old baby who won't be performing yet, but my wife's band, the Black Tones, is excellent, and people should check them out too. Take care, Adam.
Thanks for listening. I welcome your interaction with the show. Tap the microphone icon on my website to send me a voicemail. Suggest discussion topics or guests you'd like to hear conversations with. Worldwide, the show has 206 ratings on Apple Podcasts with an average of 4.9 stars with 102 reviews across all providers. Thanks for your continued support. If you add a review, I'd love to read it out on a future episode. Your ratings and reviews are one of the best ways to support the podcast. If you enjoy the show, please tell your basketball-loving friends about it. Word-of-mouth recommendations are truly worth their weight in gold. Stay up to date with my podcast and subscribe to my free NBA history newsletter. You'll receive exclusive details on upcoming episodes, future guests to appear on the show, and more. Sign up via my website or simply email me, inallairness@gmail.com. You can follow my show in various ways. Search In All Airness, 3 words, on your listening app of choice. The show is available on most platforms. Check the podcast archive for plenty more episodes with a great range of guests. Join me next time for another edition of the show.